Elements and principles of design. When we think about the created world around us, maybe like our computer lab, everything in there is built, everything is made and designed in a certain way. And I think we can have maybe an intuitive response to how things look. We have sort of a gut reaction on how we like something or maybe don't like something. But beyond just intuition, the idea of discovering elements principles of design here is so that we can maybe break things down into component parts so that we can discuss them and talk about them in more straightforward and literal ways to help us understand the things that might be more intuitive. To begin with that, we're going to be studying some different elements of design, these 2D building blocks, if you will. And this is not an exhaustive list. Others might add to things on this list or maybe take away, but these are pretty common that you might see in a 2D design class or other sorts of places. Line, shape, color, texture, pattern. And we'll be looking at the first one today with the idea of line. Now, line is a pretty common thing to kind of mention here, a connection between 2 points. We probably most commonly think about this as a positive mark. You put your pencil or pen to a piece of paper and move, and then you've got a positive mark that you're putting onto that surface. However, a line could also be from a negative gap. Think about mini blinds, and the space between those blades is a gap. It's a void. But when you look at it, you might see that space and kind of recognize it as a line. Or maybe something like an implied line. Think about going to the beach and seeing footprints in the sand going off into the distance. Those footprints aren't literally connected one to another, but in our mind's eye, we can kind of connect the path that someone has walked down the beach, creating this kind of implied line. So there's, variations on how we recognize this kind of movement from point A to point B. Now we can start to think about a line and describe it in some different ways. For example, its thickness, its texture, its weight. These are kind of ideas that we also saw in Adobe Illustrator. What is the thickness of a stroke? What's its point size? How thick, how thin is it? It might vary in its kind of texture. Thinking about changing, the brush in Adobe Illustrator changes the way that line looks. And then maybe the weight, it's kind of thick to thin transition. Does it go from very thin to very heavy and bold and back again? Something like the movement of an hourglass shape could change its weight from one place to another. Now, coming up with our design exercises, we're going to try to put this into practice with these 20 line variations. So let's think about some ways in which a line can have, its own character and look different one from another. So for example, the type of line, its movement. Is this line straight? Is it curved? Is it angular? Does it zigzag? What is its relative speed? Is it fast or slow? There are all different ways we can kind of characterize this movement of a line. What's its direction? How is it moving across the page or in relationship to other lines or other objects that might be on our surface? What is the quality of that line? How is it drawn? Is it thick, thin, heavy? Is it created by taking a pencil and just mashing it super hard into the page, or is it the most delicate and light kind of movement from one point to the next? So there are a lot of different variations. And then ultimately, too, how are those lines organized, especially when they are in relation to one another? And that's kind of what we're going to do with our second exercise is if one mark has some kind of characteristic, another mark in relationship to it builds upon that, and then we can kind of create a comparison. So the point in some of these exercises is to really take something that seems quite simple and give it a lot of variation, maybe as much as we can try to muster. Taking a regular pencil, what kind of mark can I really make with this tool? And how varied can they be? What sort of character do they reveal once we're able to do that? And then ultimately, when you put one in relation to another, can they then communicate together? So the results of these exercises will be purposely abstract. You don't have to be like a great drawer that looks, makes things look very realistic. This is more about the application, basic application of a tool between a pencil and a piece of paper. So don't worry about having to make it look like a certain thing. In fact, we're kind of shooting for the opposite, to make something rather abstract. So for example, trying to create two lines that might illustrate love, don't draw the shape of a heart. How can those two lines relate to one another to maybe suggest that emotion? And that ultimately kind of ends up with this idea of a kind of a composition, especially for this second exercise, this skillful arrangement of picture information within a frame. We're drawing basic lines. The frame that we use, in my examples, I just took my phone after having drawn them and photographed it. So I'm kind of putting the frame on afterward by how I compose it with the camera and my phone. And I'm choosing for the first exercise just to use a rectangle. It kind of fits the shape of the page. And then a square for the other ones that just seems to kind of fit those spaces well also. But this is another place where we can experiment. There are some suggestions on how to lay out effective compositions, maybe like the rule of thirds or something here. But that's a good place to start, but not always the best formula. And so hopefully we can experiment with some of these things moving forward with lines.